Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this Book Notes event with Ambassador Dennis Jett. Reminder that the event is being recorded and that your questions are happily accepted at the end. Please type those into the chat. We'll answer as many as we can get to within the allotted time. And now Ambassador Eric Rubin, the president of AFSA, will take over as moderator.
Thank you very much, Asgir, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad to see so many familiar faces, so many friends, so many colleagues, and we're so glad to have Ambassador Dennis Jett with us here today. He's been an incredible contributor to the dialogue, both before he retired from the Foreign Service and since, on our profession, on what we do, why it matters, how we might do it better. And his writings have been, I think, some of the best of their kind that any of our colleagues have done. But the book that we're going to be discussing today in this latest edition of AFSA's Book Notes is American Ambassadors, A Guide for Aspiring Diplomats and Foreign Service Officers, the second edition. And I had read the first edition and just reread the second edition last week in preparation for this event. And I have to say, it is, I think, the best book of its kind in the sense of really talking about how we got to where we are in terms of the role of American ambassadors, how we got where we are in terms of the phenomenon of political appointee ambassadors, which is not recent, and there's a lot of history, and what we might want to try to do to steer the concept of American ambassadors and hopefully have some influence on this in future administrations, but also on our own profession and on our own colleagues in the Foreign Service. It's the kind of issue that I think is, like so many things in the Foreign Service and in diplomacy, talking about reform, talking about change is really like stopping or turning an oil tanker or an ocean liner. It's very slow and very gradual. But sometimes you can avoid the iceberg, and sometimes we actually can chart a new direction, but it's challenging. And I know Dennis is going to address that. Just a couple words about Dennis, and I'll turn it over to him. He's a founding faculty member of the Penn State School of International Affairs. He had a very successful career of 28 years in the Foreign Service, and started in the Foreign Service in 1973, became ambassador to Peru and Mozambique during some very dramatic times. He was also chargé at the US Embassy in Malawi when we had 500,000 Mozambican refugees. So that was a trial by fire. And he's received the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award and lots of other awards and recognition. His academic research since he retired focuses on international relations, peacekeeping, and the relationship to US foreign policy. He previously was the Dean of the International Center at the University of Florida for 8 years. So he's also really modeled for all of us what a career post-Foreign Service, a second or third career post-Foreign Service can look like. And with that, I don't want to keep talking because I want to turn it over to Dennis. So let me just say thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to Dennis for agreeing to do this talk. And over to Dennis.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks to AFSA and all that you do to promote the Foreign Service and the professionalization of diplomacy. And thank you all for coming. I've got a dreaded PowerPoint, which I will now inflict on you if I can, which I use. I spend some time doing missionary work. By that, I mean, I go out to organizations around the country and give talks on different aspects of diplomacy, as well as I live in Pittsburgh, and I'm about half a mile down the road from Carnegie Mellon University, and they have a lifelong learning program, and I've taught a course there 3 times on what I call the challenges to foreign policy. And basically, it's just a number of different topics, but I got 50 to 60 to 70 students in each time in the course. And I think there's a lot of interest out there in what diplomacy is and why it matters, or a lot of lack of appreciation for it. And so that's one of the reasons I like to get out and do those sorts of things. Let me see. Let me start, even though it'll take a minute or two, with one of the reasons I think it's important to talk about this topic. And let's see if I can play this successfully. Can everybody hear that?
No audio.
No audio.
No audio. Okay. So that's a problem. Now I can fix that if I can get back. This is
The curse of technology. Now it'll work.
The Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearings with President Obama's ambassador nominees. Let me fill you in. It may come as a surprise or not that in order to be an ambassador to a foreign country, one doesn't necessarily have to be super familiar with that country. Take Senator Max Baucus of Montana, nominee for U.S. ambassador to China.
Senator, I am no real expert on China.
No real expert on China. An aide for the senator says he was just being humble because that is the Montana way. I guess that makes sense. But to be honest, I'm no real expert on Montana. So what do I know? Surely, though, if you're going to be an ambassador to a country, you travel there at some point, right?
Have you been to Norway?
I guess the guy who's going to be the ambassador in Norway hasn't been there. George Sunes is his name. He's a businessman. He's nominated for the ambassadorship to Norway versus Senator John McCain, ambassador of SAS. It got pretty esoteric.
What do you think the appeal of the Progress Party was? I will tell you, Norway has been very quick to denounce them. The government has denounced them. They're part of the coalition of the government. I stand corrected and would like to leave my answer at they are, it's a very, very open society.
I stand corrected. Look, not many businessmen would be able to intelligently discuss the political makeup of Norway's government. That's true, but they're not trying to be ambassador to Norway. I'm not sure Sunes even Googled Norway. He made reference to the country's president, which, by the way, Norway does not have, and stumbled over just about everything else.
The heart of our in services, but there are important that we continue. Interesting.
There's another minute of it, but it goes on pretty much the same as that. Let me now start the PowerPoint. Now I'll run through it quickly because I want to save time for questions. Let's see here. All right. So again, this is a PowerPoint that I use when I'm talking to various groups around the country and also on my students. So the purpose of the book was to talk about where ambassadors come from, where they go, what they do, and why they still matter. Or to put it another way, why the US is the only country in the world that sells the title of ambassador. And I showed you the YouTube clip, and there are a couple others. It's nice to start with what the Constitution says, which is something that people are generally not familiar with. And as usual, the Constitution doesn't say much. It says the president shall nominate and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, which is why all the promotion lists have to go over for being rubber stamped at all levels of the Foreign Service, because that's a presidential requirement, prerogative, and the ambassadors, of course, are the ones who are have to be confirmed by the Senate individually, and that they get to go do their confirmation hearing, and then if they're somebody like the one people you just saw, they can make fools themselves. And that's a kind of feature of the first year of every presidential term, because that's when all the political appointee nominations are generally rolled out. So this is a little bit of a historical perspective. Starting with the year 1800, when we had 6 diplomatic posts and 52 consular posts, and then it rose slowly on the diplomatic side, more dramatically on the consular side before it collapsed. So that's what it looks like in graphic terms, or on a graph, the horizontal axis being a timeline starting with 1781 going up to about 2000. And on the vertical axis, the number of embassies, the blue line, and the number of consular posts. That was basically the consular function back then, before the days when there were such things as visas and passports, was essentially that of a, somebody's not muted.
Doors opening, step back to allow customers to exit. When boarding, please move to the center of the car.
Somebody's riding the metro and not muted. So anyhow, the consular function was more like being a notary public and a commercial attaché, and you would sell your services, and so you could set up a consular office anywhere where you had the traffic to make enough money to sustain yourself. And so and it got very little subsidy or support from Washington. I think, and what happened in 1920 is we suddenly realized that we needed to professionalize diplomacy. And so instead of franchising the consular function, we actually replaced those people with professional diplomats, career diplomats. And the blue line, I think, indicates how slowly our foreign interest grew. And then, of course, it took off following World War II, and it took off for a couple of reasons. One, we were fighting the Cold War and decided to contest in the struggle, democracy and capitalism versus communism. We had to contest it all over the world. And one way we could do that is have embassies all over the world. And that, plus the decolonization of countries, particularly in Africa and elsewhere, that took place in the 50s and 60s, opened up a lot of places that were former colonies that were now countries and required embassies. So on this trajectory or diplomatic history, I'd say there were 3 eras. The first era was the first century of this country, where it was basically a second-rate power without a lot of impact on the international scene, nor a lot of interest in things international. We were busy stealing land from Native Americans and Mexicans. And so as we expanded westward, we were pretty much preoccupied with that. At the end of the 19th century, when industrialization and that we had exhausted our ability to steal land from others in the contiguous 48, we became more interested in international trade and therefore things international. And then we went through a period that basically the first half of the 20th century, where we professionalized diplomacy, and then the sort of post Eisenhower and beyond, where we got into what I call the 70-30 era. 70 being the ratio between career ambassadors and political appointee ambassadors. So some of the milestones in that process: in 1881, a guy named Charles Guiteau wanted to be minister in Vienna. He went to the Secretary of State after President Garfield took office. The Secretary of State told him to buzz off because he did nothing to get Garfield elected, and to express his displeasure at not getting a diplomatic appointment. And almost the entire government at that point was a patronage system. So it turned over when there was a new president from top to bottom. So this guy was disappointed, and he exercised his Second Amendment rights in that good old American way. He took a pistol and went to see Garfield give a speech and approached him and shot him. And that wound plus 19th century medicine provided a very slow and painful death for President Garfield. But it also provided an incentive for Congress to do something about professionalizing the civil service. So in 1883, they passed a law called the Pendleton Act, which said, from now on, the business of government has gotten sufficiently complicated that we need trained people who will stay around. So from now on, we're hiring civil servants on the basis of merit, we're promoting them on the basis of merit, and we're providing them a career expectation so they'll stay around and do the work of government. But that was civil service. It didn't happen for the diplomatic corps yet. 1893, another point worth noting, that was the first time we had a diplomat go abroad with the title of ambassador. Before that, because the founding fathers and after thought that ambassadors were the envoys of royalty and they did their work by carrying around a bag of cash to bribe people, and that American white males anyhow should be equal. We didn't want to bestow the title ambassador and give the impression that they were somehow better than their peers, their fellow citizens. And so we didn't name any diplomat ambassador. There were ministers and minister plenipotentiaries, but no ambassadors. In 1893, London sent us an ambassador. They didn't send ambassadors to Washington up to that point because they weren't sure whether this was a serious country that was going to last or not, but they decided in the late 19th century it was. So they sent us an ambassador level diplomat, and we in turn decided to send them an ambassador level diplomat. And so Thomas Bayard was the first one. As I said, the 1883 was the Pendleton Act, which reformed the civil service. It wasn't until 1924 when the Rogers Act reformed the foreign service. And then thanks to the corruption of the Nixon administration, there was that helped prompt the Foreign Service Act of 1980. One of the incentives for doing that was when Nixon was president, his personal lawyer went to a woman named Ruth Farkas, whose husband owned a chain of department stores. And she was a college professor, PhD, and so accomplished in her own right. But Nixon's lawyer went to Ruth Farkas and said, if you give us $250,000, we will make you ambassador to Costa Rica. And Ruth Farkas famously replied, $250,000? That's a lot of money for Costa Rica. And she nonetheless was eventually named to Luxembourg. She went there and wasn't very happy because her husband stayed home and ran the department stores, but she did write a series of checks that did, strangely enough, add up to $250,000. So what did the Foreign Service Act of 1980 said? It said ambassadors ought to be competent. They ought to normally be career members of the Foreign Service, though there will be occasions where other qualified individuals who could be or not career members can be appointed. And contributions to political campaigns should not be a factor in the appointment. It says that, very specifically. Did that change things? Let's see. Not a lot. It brought it down. Before the Foreign Service Act of 1980, it was about 35% political appointees. After the Foreign Service Act of 1980, the percentage of political appointees dropped to about 31%. That's not including Trump, which is kind of an outlier in a whole lot of respects. So you can see the ratio there between career to political appointees. Trump, Reagan got it up to 38% political. Trump hopefully will be the only person to reach 43%, even though he had 36 vacancies at the end. Biden currently is running at 40% career and 60% political appointee ambassadors. And so people are going to say, oh my God, this is worse than Trump. Well, in every year, every presidential term in the first year, there's invariably media stories that say, oh, President so-and-so is appointing a higher percentage of political appointee ambassadors than anybody has seen, previously. Well, the reason for that is you can't really say meaningfully what the percentage is going to be until the end of a presidential term. The norm has become, and I'm telling a lot of you what you already know, that when a new presidential term starts, all the ambassadors send in their resignation. All the career people get their resignations returned, almost all of them, with a thank you very much, but go ahead and serve out whatever's remaining on your 3-year tour. All of the political appointees are removed immediately. Sometimes, if the president is feeling nice, they'll let them stay until their replacement is appointed. But Trump didn't do that, and neither did Biden. So January 20th, the 30%, if it's a normal presidency, of political appointees, they're gone. So you have to replace 100% of the 30%, but only a third of the 70%, if you see what I mean. So political appointee ambassador nominations are front loaded in the first year. So it's always going to be appallingly high, and then it's going to go down over the course of the presidential term too. And they said this about Obama too, and Obama, in the end, it was 70-30. I don't need to explain to you about the 5 tracks of the Foreign Service non-Washington audience that's useful, but it just gives you an illustration of the ratio between, or you've got 8,000 Foreign Service officers, roughly divided equally between the 5 cones. I don't know if they still call them cones. Getting into the senior Foreign Service, though, it gets skewed toward political, and becoming an ambassador, half of the ambassadors are political, 20% are economic, and about 10% for each of the other 3 cones. Does that mean you should despair if you're not? Well, no, but you can read my book and you can figure out your own strategy if that's what you really want to do. So the problem I have with the whole American system, and again, as far as I can tell, it's unique in the world that we have an open market on political appointees who buy their way to an ambassadorship. 27 of the 58 Biden nominees thus far were among the bundlers. Bundlers are people who quite literally put together the contributions of others in a bundle, tie them in a nice, neat ribbon, and present them to the campaign. Biden had 818 people who bundled more than $100,000. And so Republicans, however, there's no requirement to reveal who your bundlers are. And so Republicans refuse to do it. Democrats put the information out there, but this is $100,000 or more by 818 people. And so it could be $1 million, it could be $101,000. So it's pretty raw, but it gives you an idea of who's getting access. And so of the Biden nominees, 27 are bundlers. 47% of his ambassador nominations are people who bundled 100,000 more. And then you also have personal contributions, obviously. 10 gave in the 5-figure range, the tens of thousands of dollars. 12 gave hundreds of thousands of dollars, and 3 over $1 million. So about 59%, all told, gave either major money or bundled money, or did both, gave and bundled. Under Trump, it was a different story. Being a businessman, he had business interests to protect. So if you were a member of Mar-a-Lago or another golf club, you had a good chance of getting a nomination. The membership of those clubs is not public, but there were at least 5 members of his golf clubs who got nominations. Also, Trump took the limit off of contributions to his inauguration. He collected $107 million, had twice as much money on hand than Obama did, and had half as many events as Obama did. So where all that money went is one of those mysteries that's been under investigation forever, and like a lot of investigations never seems to reach a conclusion. But 15 of the people who got put up for ambassadorships gave a total of $5 million. 3 of them wrote checks for $1 million, and all 3 have a history of sexual misconduct, racist remarks, or both. That would be the clown that was in London, who fired his DCM for saying something nice about Barack Obama. The famous Mr. Sondland, who thought Ukraine was part of the European Union, apparently. And then there was another guy who actually didn't get confirmed, but I don't know. Nixon actually went to people who gave him money, and if they didn't get confirmed, he offered to give them their money back. I don't know. I doubt that Mr. Trump has ever offered to give any money that he's received back. So let me move on here. Where do they go? Again, this is mostly for a general audience. You probably know this intuitively, but here are the numbers. Political appointees go to rich countries and island nations. And a colleague and I actually did a formula for figuring out how much London costs more than Lisbon. And the higher the gross domestic product of a country and the more tourists it gets, the more likely it is to get a political appointee ambassador. And the more likely it is, well, the more it will cost in terms of political contributions. Career officers, Central Asia. I don't think there's ever been a political appointee in Central Asia. I think there was one civil servant. Africa, Middle East. Looking at it regionally in terms of percentages, where it's more than the 30% norm for political appointees, ambassadors, Western Europe, all those nice countries in Western Europe, the Caribbean and Oceania and North and Central America. Where it's less than 30%, it's, other parts of the world, particularly Central Asia, South America, Africa, 15%, Middle East, 15%. In other words, wherever there is a post with a hardship differential or a danger pay differential, there is almost zero chance that the political ambassador or the ambassador will be a political appointee. All right. Let's see. I talk a little bit about what ambassadors do. I don't think I need to tell you that because you all know what they do. Essentially, it's internal management and external relationships, if you had to boil it down to simplest terms. How do we know how when it's being done well? Well, one of the problems with government in general is that there are no metrics. You're never going to hear a Secretary of State say, our foreign policy was 14.7% better this quarter than last quarter. I mean, if you're in the private sector and all that matters is money and the bottom line, then you can make those sort of calculations. And you can't do that in government. You can't. Often you can't agree on what you're trying to do, and even if you agree on what you're trying to do, how do you measure it and how much? It's just not possible. And this is where I think we need an inspector general because the inspector general reports can and each one, and you can go to the inspector general's website and you can read the post reports when all the ones that have come out and previous ones, and they start off with a section on the management of the mission. How well did the ambassador and the DCM do? And so under Obama, there were ambassadors in Kenya, Malta, Bahamas, and Luxembourg who got bad IG reports, and they all resigned. Under Trump, being a pretty shameless lot, there were lots of really bad ambassadors. I don't know. I would say worst ambassadors ever, probably Trump, and Reagan would have to be competing for that. But again, it's hard to measure. So, and there have been some real turkeys in all administrations. So this is favorite ways to fail. If you're a career ambassador, I think one of the challenges is making a transition to a diverse workforce. And thankfully, almost all career ambassadors are DCMs first. So they have an opportunity to fail at the DCM level before they can fail as an ambassador. But you go from up through the ranks of the Foreign Service, working with other Foreign Service officers and managing other Foreign Service officers. And then all of a sudden you're a DCM or eventually an ambassador. And you've got people from all these other different agencies with all these other different agendas. And they all stand up and when you come in the room and say yes or no, sir, and that sort of stuff. But they all know that their next promotion and their next assignment depends a lot more on somebody back in Washington than it does the ambassador. So that's, sometimes challenging. I think there's a tendency, and I must say I probably suffered from this, of sort of not being approachable enough, and you need to listen and care for your troops, particularly your junior officers, and mentoring them. Political appointees, on the other hand, can suffer from those, but also they have attitude problems. I had one political appointee ambassador tell me that he looked at his DCM and considered him the enemy. And so one of my suggestions was that people ought to be, political appointee ambassadors ought to spend at least 6 months in Washington at FSI, taking courses, language, whatever, just so they interact with the professional, the career Foreign Service people, officers and support staff and other specialists and other people going abroad to work in an embassy, so they know that these people, they're there to serve their country and not to undermine the president because they happen to disagree with him or her someday. So the other thing that political appointee ambassadors sometimes don't do is they don't show up. The woman who was fired when under Obama as ambassador to the Bahamas liked living in Los Angeles more than spending time in the Bahamas. And when she did come to the Bahamas, she worked out of her home rather than go into the embassy. So that's one of the reasons she got a bad report. And the other thing that people coming in from the outside, particularly as a lot of these people do, they have no experience in government, no experience in the military, no experience of significance in international affairs. And all of a sudden they discover that there are limits to being a government employee. Limits like the Hatch Act, which of course Carla Sands, the ambassador in Denmark, studiously ignored, and not to mention lots of other people in the White House. And since the Hatch Act apparently has no teeth, I guess Mr. Hatch's teeth fell out long ago, if he ever had them, there's no sort of penalty for that. So I have to explain why it matters that diplomacy is not explained to a general audience, that diplomacy is not endless cocktail parties and not paying your parking tickets. It's the essence of soft power is good diplomacy. And if you debilitate your soft power, then when you're confronted with a challenge, your options are ignoring it or your hard power being economic sanctions, or the hardest hard power, sending in the Marines. And so that kind of limits what you can do. Globalization is not fake news, and it's the source, I think, of all the significant problems that we face today. And the United States, regardless of how powerful it is, can't address problems that ignore national borders by itself. And so we have to have. Why won't it get better? Lack of serious congressional oversight. I mean, there have been a lot of comments recently about how the Senate is not confirming people, but they're not confirming people for the wrong reason. You know, Ted Cruz is saying, oh, unless I get my way at Nord Stream 2, I'm going to stomp my feet and pout and hold my breath and not approve any ambassadors. Well, you know, Nord Stream 2 is one thing, but letting embassies go without ambassadors for years on end it should not be the result of a disagreement over something like Nord Stream 2. McCain took an interest in Mr. Souness, as you saw in the clip from Anderson Cooper. But generally, that's a rare exception, mostly when the Senate is not being an obstacle or individual senators. It's a rubber stamp. You know, you go through, you go there, and you give your little, I'm the nominee, thankful for the president for nominating me, and I'm going to improve relations with whatever country I'm going to. And the senators, if they show up at all, ask a nice question or two. The other reason it's not going to get any better is our esteemed Supreme Court, in its infinite wisdom, has issued a couple decisions, Citizens United being one, and I think Valero being the other, which basically said free speech includes unlimited anonymous corporate giving to campaigns. And so that, on the face of it, strikes me as kind of stupid, that free speech could be money for attack ads and anonymous. But, you know, who am I to question the wisdom of Mr. Alito and Mr. Thomas and the rest of them? And so money has thoroughly corrupted our political process, and it's getting worse. 2016 presidential election, $2.4 billion spent. 2020, $6.6 billion. And so the president of the United States is the most powerful man in the world, but he doesn't have all that much power when it comes to rewarding people for supporting him. And so one of the ways he does it is by basically selling the title ambassador. Now he gives appointments for other reasons. You have to help the president get elected. You can do that like Jeff Flake and Cindy McCain, being Republicans who endorsed Biden. Sometimes it's because the person was your roommate in college. Obama nominated his college roommate to Belize. George W. Bush nominated a bunch of people from his Skull and Bones secret society at Yale. Or there are political reasons. You know, Jon Huntsman was appointed ambassador to China and thought that he wouldn't therefore run for the presidency against Obama. Well, that didn't work out, but Huntsman didn't get the Republican nomination anyhow. And then, of course, there's the commercial relationships that Trump brought to it. So that $6.6 billion, that's probably 6.6 billion reasons why it won't change, and why the status quo the status quo exists not because of the absence of a good idea to correct it. It exists because there are forces that profit from the status quo and will fight like hell to defend it. And so it's going to be hard. The $6.6 billion industry that presidential elections have become, it's just going to be very hard to change that. But I think we can insist on full transparency. We ought to have detailed information on bundlers, for instance. That ought to be a requirement and not something people can do if they feel like it. We ought to have language testing of all nominees, career and political. FSI does a good job of it. And I'm really tired of hearing political nominees saying, oh, I speak conversational Spanish or conversational French. Well, it matters whether the conversation is at a kindergarten level or an educated level. Accountability, I think, is the most important thing. Would be have the IG measure the performance of every ambassador every year. Right now, they're supposed to inspect an embassy once every 5 years. Because they make it such a complicated, expensive process, they only get around to doing it once every 10 years. So they ought to send out a questionnaire, the kind of questionnaire, and some of you undoubtedly have filled these out. When they come to an embassy to do an inspection, they give a questionnaire to everybody, and it's too long and kind of silly, but they could send an abbreviated form of that to every American and every embassy every year, and they get back the returns. And the basic question is, you know, they're out there to root out waste, fraud, and mismanagement. Well, they've got their priorities wrong. It should be mismanagement, fraud, and waste. I don't care if somebody takes home a couple paper clips. What I do care is whether the ambassador is managing the embassy well. And so if they sent out this questionnaire and they got back an alarm bell report that said everybody in the embassy in country X thinks the ambassador is not doing a good job, then they should immediately send a senior inspector out to have a little heart-to-heart with the ambassador and see if the problem is correctable. And if not, make a recommendation that the person be removed, as were the four people under Obama. And the other thing that boils down to is whether there's any interest in the part of the public and the Congress. But it's not going to happen. You know, we're not going to have elections financed by taxpayer dollars, unfortunately. What happened to George Soros, that clown that was on so bad that he was on Anderson Cooper, and he was also on The Daily Show by Jon Stewart? He's been nominated by Biden as ambassador to Greece. And the reason he did that is because he gave Biden a lot of money, but he also spent a lot of money on congressional candidates as well. When Soros had his confirmation hearing recently, he's from New York. He was introduced by two senators, which is always good strategy to have a senator introduce you. He was introduced by Senator Casey of Pennsylvania, who he has given several $1,000s. The other introducer was Rand Paul, who Soros has given tens of thousands of dollars. I think it's probably the last time that Casey and Rand Paul agreed on anything, but they both were there to make the pitch that Soros should be conferred. Cory Booker, the only question that Soros got was a kind of setup question by Cory Booker. Tens of thousands of dollars in Soros money has gone to Cory Booker. And of course, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Mr. Menendez, who is no stranger to ethical questions, has gotten at least $137,000 in money from Soros, and is, according to media reports, the one who pushed him to be named ambassador to Greece. So, you know, some people say, oh, you know, this guy is a Greek American. What a great idea of sending him to Greece. Well, you've all heard of clientitis or localitis. I mean, sometimes you develop that, supposedly. Most of the time it's because Washington doesn't want to hear what the people in your country are actually thinking. But, you know, going to a country where you have relatives in the country, there are going to be all kinds of expectations, etc. So actually, no, it's not a good idea to send somebody with such ties to a country that could be used or create expectations or suspicions, etc. But in any event, we're going to have Senator Flake in Turkey and Mr. Soros in Greece, two amateur ambassadors, and the fact that these two countries have a history of going to war on occasion. I mean, what could go wrong? And what a great thing for American diplomacy. And with that, I will stop and throw it open to whatever questions, complaints, observations, or anything else that people would care to offer. Yeah, Janet Potash observed that the number of countries increased quite a bit due to decolonization. I think I mentioned that. Yeah, when I was in EUR at the Regional Ambassador Conference, almost all were political. Well, yep, Western Europe certainly, and a growing number in Eastern Europe.
Thanks, Dennis. Let me just pick up for 1 second, and then we will go to chat questions. I had one to ask, and also just one note to make. Thank you for the excellent explanation on the percentages between career ambassadorial nominees and political. I think it should be noted that not only is this common in the first year of an administration, but President Biden did keep, to my knowledge, not only all of the career ambassadors he inherited from President Trump, but actually kept one political, and that would be John Sullivan, who's still serving in Moscow during this crisis, who was very much a Republican political appointee. That said, we're going to be watching these numbers very carefully. We do have a commitment that they're going to get to 70-30. It will be a while, I think, as you pointed out. And that leads to my question, which is, we've always had donors, even since 1980 in the Foreign Service Act, which pretty explicitly says we're not supposed to have appointments, nominations for ambassadorships in exchange for donations. It has always happened. I believe the smallest percentage was Carter, not just in terms of politicals, but percentage of the politicals who were donors. They didn't have bundlers in those days. I think Carter appointed a lot of state and local officials, and we do have some of that in this administration as well. But this leads to the question, with close to a third of the ambassadorships being vacant and not having a nominee, separate from the question of Senate holds and all that, but this administration just not having, after 13 months in office, nominated anyone to fill these vacancies, and that includes Ukraine in the middle of this crisis, and a lot of other critical posts. Is this part of a pattern of, which you talk about somewhat in your book, of downgrading the role and importance of ambassadors, in the sense that if in the middle of a crisis like that, it's okay with the president to have a career chargé in Kyiv and not an ambassador, does that mean that an ambassador wouldn't make a difference in their mind? How do you see this trend going on?
Well, I don't think it would apply in the Ukraine, because the Ukraine is one of those places where it's always going to be a career ambassador. So I wouldn't think I would. Each president sets up his own White House personnel management system, and sometimes in Republicans, some of the Bushes have had. And some of the Democrats have had very professional people who had background in headhunting, in doing executive search and that sort of thing. Under Trump, you had a 20-something guy who was addicted to online gambling, and who General Kelly threw out of the White House because he wouldn't give him a security clearance. And of course, Kelly left and Trump brought him back. And this guy was basically the political commissar who was out trying to root out anybody who was insufficiently loyal to Trump. And his deputy was some guy who, like early 20s, who didn't even have a college degree. So, it depends on the president and how the president organizes himself. Under one of the oral histories I read, I think it was one of the Bushes, maybe the first Bush, they said the system of choosing ambassadors was bog sat, bunch of old white guys sitting around a table or something like that. So it's whoever the president wants to listen to and whoever he wants to run White House personnel. And so I don't know whether it's just they're kind of overwhelmed or what is. I'd like not to think it's any lack of interest in having people out there. It's just that, and of course, vetting the people requires a certain amount of time too, unless you're somebody who doesn't care about the background of the people in question. So I don't know. I've seen the same articles, and I don't have an explanation for it, but it's certainly something that doesn't help our diplomacy or our national security.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a point that AFSA will continue to make publicly and privately, as well as with a lot of the Washington positions, from the State Department Inspector General to a whole bunch of the Assistant Secretary positions that remain without nominees. And while we were pretty scathing in denouncing the Senate holds, we I think have to acknowledge and criticize the fact that we really have a large number of jobs without nominees well more than a year after Inauguration Day. So thank you. I think I should stop talking and turn it over to Asgir so we can take some questions in the chat. If you haven't submitted a question and you'd like to, now is the time to do it. So please put that in the chat. I think we have a couple. So I'll turn it back to Asgir and just thank Dennis for terrific presentation. And we'll come back at the end to wrap things up, but over to Asgir for now.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, we have a number of questions already in the chat, so we will try to go through as many as we can. Let's start with this one. Could someone sue to force the enforcement of the Foreign Service Act, given the clear presence of donors, which is prohibited by the law?
Yeah, actually, I got that question this morning when I gave a talk earlier today to a group in India. I don't know. I know some lawyers. My program at Penn State, it sits in the law school and reports to the dean of the law school. So I'm going to ask some of my lawyer friends. It certainly would be nice, because I think it's beyond mere statistical accident that I think the total 59% of the political appointees either bundled, gave their own money, or did both. So that's beyond mere chance. So I wish somebody would sue, and I'll have to find out if I can do it.
Thank you for that. Next question. Do you believe that economic development in coming decades in Latin America, Africa, and other emerging markets will mean that we'll see more political appointees overall, meaning that as more countries achieve middle income status and become more attractive to live in?
Yeah, it certainly is a question of attractiveness. Prior to the 1990s, every ambassador in the Dominican Republic was a career officer. And then somebody in the White House discovered the Dominican Republic has nice beaches. And ever since then, it's been political appointees. So I think the only real limiting factor is the number of attractive places to which people will go. I don't know that that's going to change much in Africa. In Latin America, some of the ones are attractive enough. Uruguay is a very attractive place, almost always political. Same thing with Costa Rica. Chile, Argentina go back and forth. Mexico, a bit back and forth. So yeah, attractiveness is important. And it also, as the economy grows, it gives these people who come in from the private sector an opportunity to make money off the connections they establish as ambassador when they leave a government. So yeah, that will probably be a factor that pushing upward the number of political appointees.
Thank you. Next question is, do some countries prefer political appointees over career FSOs because their leaders believe an appointee has the ear of the president?
That's often an argument offered for why political appointees are not bad. But I first of all, it's not true that many of these people actually have a relationship with the president to the extent that they could pick it up the phone and get him to answer. And second thing, I think it's probably in the overwhelming number of cases a bad thing, because the president, as you all well know, the chain of command is ambassador, assistant secretary for the region, secretary of state, then the president. So if the ambassador is picking up the phone talking to the president, you're cutting out the entire State Department, the entire National Security Council, and a few thousand other people who generally like to weigh in on policy decisions. And so it's a prescription for incoherent and uncoordinated policy. And some countries say that they like the idea that the prestige. In fact, I read one country complained, I think Belgium complained that the political appointee that they received gave less money than the political appointee that went to Holland or something. I don't know whether that was serious or not, but sometimes the people say it and sometimes countries say it, but it's a bad excuse, a bad justification.
All right, thank you. Given that there is such a strong public diplomacy element to being an ambassador, why are there so few PD officers getting named to ambassadorships?
Yeah, I like that question because I have a theory. And the theory quite simply is because the undersecretary for political public diplomacy, you look at the people who have held the job. First of all, it's the only undersecretary job where the majority of people have been women. So I guess the idea is if you put a woman's face on our public diplomacy, it somehow sells better. I don't know. But the other aspect of it is there's never been a career person in that job. And all of those people have averaged probably staying in the job for less than a year, maybe half a year or something like that. It's been a lot of churn through there in that job. And one of the things that I think that determines how successful any particular cone is do you have somebody on the D committee, the high level committee that chooses ambassadors to send to the White House for approval? Do you have a protector, somebody who's promoting you? You've got an undersecretary for political affairs, one for economic affairs. The DG takes care of consular affairs, but this undersecretary for public diplomacy who is clueless, who doesn't have any idea who these people are, who doesn't understand the importance of promoting PD officers to ambassadorships as a way of attracting good people and keeping them. None of that is understood by anybody who stays in the job for 6 months to a year and then goes off and does something else. So I think that's the fundamental reason. It's the kind of bureaucratic mechanics and politics of it.
Very much. Next question is, have you ever done an analysis of political appointees by cross-party affiliation?
I'm not sure what that means. Cross-party affiliation.
I believe the meaning is folks from one party appointed ambassadors by a president of an opposing party.
Okay, most of the time when that happens, like with Cindy McCain and Flake, it's because they endorsed the presidential candidate of the other party. They don't give money. Jon Huntsman, appointed by Obama for whatever reason, maybe it was Obama's attempt to have a bilateral foreign policy, or as the Washington Post speculated at the time, it was an attempt to eliminate Huntsman as a potential competitor in the next election, which didn't work, of course, but because Huntsman resigned and came home, and then tried to get the Republican nomination and failed because it was far too reasonable to win that. So yeah, there is some of that back and forth, but usually, again, it's about you did something to help the president get elected, and when it's somebody from another party, it's almost never about money, and there may be a motivation for a sort of bipartisan foreign policy, but that's pretty rare too.
We have a couple more questions, and I'm going to try to squeeze them both in. One is whether you can think of presidents who have appointed academics and/or pundits as political ambassadors.
Well, I certainly hope not. Next question.
All right. Could you discuss the impact to ambassadorships and the Foreign Service in general of the Trump administration?
Well, you all are in a much better position to make that assessment than me. I think Trump was the most corrupt and incompetent president in American history. And as I start off my book, this is the second edition of which just came out in December. And if anybody wants a copy signed by the author, by the way, you can contact me and we'll make arrangements. It'll probably cost you less than Amazon is charging. But in any event, I think the biggest threat to American democracy is Donald Trump, and continues to be Donald Trump, and continues to be the big lie. There's, I was in countries where having elections in Mozambique for the first time in their history, and there's nothing, and this is something that the Supreme Court didn't realize in 2000. I was in Florida in 2000 when Mr. Bush supposedly won Florida. There's nothing more important than the confidence of the voter in the integrity of the election process. And if you take that away, then you're wasting your time. Democracy will fail to function. And you still got a huge percentage of people who believe the big lie. And as Gerbil said, you repeat the lie often enough and people will believe it. So, and the effect of Trump on the State Department is hard to imagine, and it'll take years to recover. not to mention the impact on American diplomacy and foreign policy and our impression abroad. I mean, if you are Iranian right now, would you be willing to sit down and sign a deal with Mr. Biden when you know that in 3 years, 2 years, Mr. Trump might be back? It does not give either our enemies or our allies much confidence in their ability to predict what we were going to do, what we will do next. And that's bad.
Thank you, Ambassador. Being mindful of the time, I think we have done all the questions that came in, so I will hand it off to Ambassador Rubin to wrap things up.
Thank you very much, and thanks for all the great questions. And before I wrap it up, I just wanted to say in answer to Janet's question, there have been a bunch of academics. We currently have one, the newly confirmed ambassador to Berlin, Amy Gutmann, who's been the president of the University of Pennsylvania, certainly an academic. She's a philosopher and a full professor. But going back, we did have people like Edwin Reischauer in Tokyo, and I recall Senator Dodd's brother Thomas Dodd, who was a Latin Americanist in Uruguay and I think Costa Rica. Anyway, occasionally it happens. But I will say, just on behalf of all of us at AFSA, and I think we speak for many, if not most of our members, the high percentage of bundlers and donors is a concern. We're not going to fight if we get back to 70-30. I think that's reality in terms of political appointees, but we're going to be keeping a very close look at qualifications. I have to say, I've been given the privilege of meeting with and talking to all of the political appointee ambassadors in this administration when they go to FSI, and overall, I'm favorably impressed. Certainly compared to the last group that I knew very well, but the law says you're not supposed to be able to buy ambassadorships. It's been going on for probably close to 100 years, and you've got to keep a strong eye on that. The other thing that we're pushing is, regardless of how people get to be ambassadors, how they lead their teams, how they take care of their people and the family members and their local staff is really critical. It would be good to have an inspector general. It would be good for this administration to nominate one. And as I've been saying, if you fail to nominate one after over a year, people are going to ask, maybe you don't want to have an inspector general, and that's not good. So I hope we'll see that soon. With that, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I would encourage everyone to purchase the book. We can't do a book signing virtually, but it's a great book and available just about everywhere online, and I hope in some bookstores. And I really, really enjoyed it. The second edition is tremendous. I want to thank Dennis for this really great talk and for all the work he's done, delving very deeply into what it means to be an ambassador, what people need to do to prepare to be ambassadors, and how we might do this better. As several people noted, we're the only country that does this, and I think it's getting more and more problematic as our ability to just coast and keep our leadership in the world without really trying is no longer such a good model for American leadership. So let's hope that we can make some progress. I'm certainly committed to working in support of our members on this, and I want to thank Dennis again. Thank him for all of the talks and all of the work he's done as an AFSA member and speaker. And thank you all for joining us. It's been a great discussion, and I hope we'll see you at the next book talks that we have coming, including on March 30th with Ambassador Masha Ivanovich on her new book, which is entitled Lessons from the Edge, and it's out March 15th. So thank you, and then just back to Asgir to close.
Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you joining us today. As Ambassador Rubin said, we have a lot of events coming up, including Ambassador Jovanovic. You will, of course, receive notification as AFSA members, and we'll hope to see you then. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Asgir, and thank you all for coming.